with the news that a judge has ruled that the former US President Donald Trump has paid nearly $355 million to New York State for lying about the values of his properties.
He was banned from serving as a company director or taking out loans from banks in the state for 3 years. This is what Trump had to say after the ruling.
He ruled against me before he even got the case. He ruled against me, said I was guilty. He didn't know what I was guilty of before he even got the case. And Letitia James, that's another case altogether. She's a horribly corrupt attorney general, and it's all having to do with election interference.
Well, let's talk to Professor of History at the US Army War College, Ronald Granieri. Good to see you this morning, Ronald. What do you make of all of this? Because whereas it is clearly important, it just feels like yet another case that he comes out and says it's all nonsense. Who are we to believe in all of this?
Well, we do run into this difficult question, right? Is we don't have many other experiences with someone running for president who is subject to these kinds of subject to these kinds of legal problems. He's within his rights to say that he's not guilty, but he also valued Mar-a-Lago to be worth more than Buckingham Palace in order to secure loans. So the question is, what sorts of things has he violated the statutes by inflating the values, and what this all means going forward. It's so unusual, as are so many other things with him. And we run into this problem, and people say it's unprecedented. We've never done this to a presidential candidate. Well, a presidential candidate has never been as deeply involved in such questionable business deals either.
So what happens if he can't pay?
That's a good question. What happens if he can't pay? My understanding, and I'm a historian, and I will say that my opinions are my own and not those of the Army War College or the U.S. Army. But if he is responsible he can of course appeal the amounts. But in order to make the appeal, he has to put up a bond for the equivalent value, which has to be kept in escrow. So basically, he'll have to find someone to front him. If he doesn't have the money, have someone to front him at least until he can go through his appeals to see what the final amounts he has to pay would be.
Which is the interesting thing, isn't it? Because I think he's got 30 days to lodge an appeal in all of this. And he's obviously very, very likely to do that. And so we're going to end up with a lot of these court cases that are going to carry on. They're going to be in escrow themselves, if you like, all these court cases, for months, possibly years. So it could all, in effect, it could disappear, couldn't it, or fail to reach a final conclusion before the election?
Some of these cases certainly could. This one in New York State is complicated because it's a state and not a federal case, and it's a civil, not a criminal trial. But some of the other cases that are federal, basically a President Trump could order the Justice Department to simply drop them. Which is also an unusual situation to be in. The long-term question about how he deals with New York, that even as president, he would have a hard time getting out from underneath this, unless he succeeds on his legal appeals.
Ronald, this obviously is a civil case, but he has got 1 or 2 criminal cases coming up. So there's, 4 or 5 more cases coming up altogether?
I believe it's 4. I'm trying to keep track, but there's the question of the classified documents that's down in Florida. There's the question of the election interference in Fulton County, Georgia, around Atlanta. There's the question of the January 6th insurrection hearings in Washington D.C. And then there was this as well. So. Yeah, it's a lot. And
but isn't there also in this still a US Supreme Court ruling to be made on presidential immunity?
Yes, and that of course hangs over it all as well. As while a federal appeals court has rejected his claim of immunity, and this is especially with regard to the January 6th case, the question of whether the things that he said or did in and around January 6th, were they part of his official duties as president, and if so, does that mean he's immune from prosecution? A The federal appeals court says he's not immune, but it will be or has been appealed to the Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court is eventually going to have to rule on that question, and then depending on where that goes, that would then let us know what we could expect from the other trials. But it is this is the kind of thing, right? As a historian, I like to think about how complicated the past was. It's the tough part of being a historian of contemporary events is, right, they keep making more history every day. And in this case, right, the history seems to get even more complicated. And so we will eventually have to figure out what this all means.
Yeah, it's a mess. Ronald Granieri, good to see you. Thanks very much indeed.